You know what's crazy? There's a war that killed more people than World War I. A conflict that reshaped the entire world as we know it, that changed borders, toppled empires, and set in motion events that we're still dealing with today. And yet, most people have never even heard of it. I'm not talking about some small skirmish in a forgotten corner of the world. I'm talking about a massive, brutal conflict that involved dozens of countries, millions of soldiers, and some of the most horrific atrocities in human history. So why don't we learn about it in school? Why isn't it in our textbooks? Well, that's exactly what we're going to uncover today, because the story of how this war was deliberately erased from history is almost as shocking as the war itself. Before we dive in, I want you to think about something for a second. When you learned about World War I in school, what came after it? You probably learned about the Treaty of Versailles, maybe the Roaring Twenties, the Great Depression, and then World War II, right? But there's this massive gap, this blank space in history that nobody really talks about. And in that gap, hidden in plain sight, is one of the deadliest conflicts in human history. It's called the Russian Civil War, but that name doesn't even begin to capture the scale and the horror of what actually happened. Now, I know what you're thinking. The Russian Civil War? I might have heard something about that. Reds versus whites, communists versus monarchists, right? But here's the thing. What you probably learned, if you learned anything at all, is just the tip of the iceberg. The real story is so much bigger, so much more complex, and so much more devastating than anything you were taught. We're talking about a conflict that lasted from 1918 to 1922, though some argue it actually continued well into the 1920s, a war where the death toll is still debated, but conservative estimates put it at around 7 to 12 million people. Some historians think it might be even higher, possibly 15 million or more, when you factor in the famines and diseases that came with it. To put that in perspective, World War I killed about 17 million people total. The Russian Civil War, which most people have barely heard of, killed nearly as many, possibly more, when you consider the indirect deaths. And here's the kicker. It wasn't just Russians fighting Russians. This was a truly international conflict. The United States sent troops. Britain sent troops. France, Japan, Canada, Italy, Greece, Serbia, Poland, China, and more all got involved. American soldiers fought and died on Russian soil, and most Americans today have no idea even happened. So let's start at the beginning, because to understand why this war was erased from history, you first need to understand what actually happened. The stage was set in 1917, when the Russian Revolution toppled the Tsar and eventually brought the Bolsheviks, led by Vladimir Lenin, to power. Now, the Bolsheviks had promised three things: peace, land, and bread. They wanted to get Russia out of World War I, redistribute land to the peasants, and solve the food shortages that were devastating the country. Sounds reasonable, right? Except their methods for achieving these goals were, let's say, controversial. And by controversial, I mean they sparked a civil war that would tear the country apart. On one side, you had the Reds, the Bolsheviks, and their supporters. These were the communists, the revolutionaries, who wanted to completely transform Russian society. On the other side, you had the Whites, a loose coalition of monarchists, liberals, moderate socialists, and anyone else who opposed the Bolsheviks. But here's where it gets complicated. The Whites weren't a unified group. They had different goals, different leaders, and often couldn't agree on anything except their hatred of the Bolsheviks. You also had the Greens, which were mostly peasant armies fighting for local autonomy. You had various nationalist movements in Ukraine, Finland, Poland, the Baltic states, and the Caucasus, all trying to break away and form their own countries. And then you had the foreign intervention forces, armies from over a dozen countries that sent troops into Russia ostensibly to keep Russia in World War I, or to protect their interests, or to prevent the spread of communism. The result was absolute chaos. Imagine a map of Russia and the former Russian Empire, and now imagine it's like a jigsaw puzzle that's been thrown in the air, different groups controlling different territories, armies marching back and forth across thousands of miles. And in between all of this, ordinary people just trying to survive. The violence was staggering. This wasn't a war fought along clear front lines like World War I. This was a war where anyone could be the enemy. Villages would be taken and retaken multiple times, and each time that happened, people would be executed for supposedly collaborating with the other side. The Red Terror was a systematic campaign of mass killings, torture, and oppression, carried out by the Bolsheviks against anyone they deemed an enemy of the revolution. We're talking about summary executions, hostage-taking, concentration camps, and widespread atrocities. But the whites weren't any better. The White Terror saw similar atrocities, and in many cases, the white armies carried out pogroms against Jewish communities, killing tens of thousands of innocent people. These pogroms were some of the worst anti-Semitic violence in history up to that point, and they're often overlooked when we talk about this period. And then there's the famine. Oh God, the famine. Between 1921 and 1922, a catastrophic famine struck Russia, particularly the Volga region. The combination of war, drought, and the Bolshevik policy of requisitioning grain from peasants led to one of the worst humanitarian disasters of the 20th century. People were literally starving to death by the millions.
My child,
There are
hold on,
documented
please.
cases of cannibalism,
There's nothing
parents
left.
eating their own children. I'm not being dramatic here. This actually happened, and it was widespread enough that the Bolshevik government had to issue specific laws against it. The American Relief Administration, led by Herbert Hoover, who would later become president, organized a massive relief effort that probably saved millions of lives. But even this humanitarian mission has been largely forgotten. Most Americans have no idea that their country helped prevent an even greater catastrophe in Soviet Russia. And here's something that really blows my mind. During this civil war, there were moments of such surreal violence and chaos that they sound like something out of a dystopian novel. There was the Czechoslovak Legion, about 50,000 Czech and Slovak soldiers who had been fighting for Russia in World War I and now found themselves stranded in Siberia. They ended up controlling the entire Trans-Siberian Railway for a time, essentially holding half of Russia hostage as they tried to make their way home. Their revolt against the Bolsheviks actually sparked much of the initial phase of the Civil War. Then you had Admiral Kolchak, who proclaimed himself the supreme ruler of Russia and led the white forces in Siberia. He had possession of the Russian imperial gold reserves, about 650 tons of gold that had been evacuated from Moscow. This gold became a source of intrigue, betrayal, and ultimately tragedy, as Kolchak was eventually captured and executed by the Bolsheviks, and the gold disappeared. Some of it was recovered, but the fate of all that gold remains a mystery even today. In the south, you had General Denikin leading white forces in a march on Moscow that came terrifyingly close to succeeding. In the north, you had British, American, and other Allied forces occupying Arkhangelsk and Murmansk. In the east, you had the Japanese occupying large parts of Siberia and the Russian Far East. In the west, newly independent Poland was fighting the Soviets in what became known as the Polish-Soviet War, and scattered throughout all of this, you had anarchist movements, like the one led by Nestor Makhno in Ukraine, who fought against both the Reds and the Whites, and tried to create an anarchist society. The level of suffering was unimaginable. Typhus, cholera, and other diseases swept through the country, killing millions. The economy completely collapsed. People in cities were starving because the countryside was devastated by the fighting and couldn't produce food. Infrastructure was destroyed, railways were torn up, bridges were blown up, entire cities were depopulated. And in the midst of all this, you had the Bolsheviks trying to implement their vision of a communist society, which often made things worse in the short term, even if they believed it would lead to a better future. So now here's the big question. Why don't we learn about this? Why has this enormous, world-changing conflict been largely erased from our textbooks and our collective memory? Well, there are actually multiple reasons, and they're all pretty fascinating in their own right. First, let's talk about the Soviet Union's role in erasing this history. When the Bolsheviks won the Civil War, they immediately set about controlling the narrative. In Soviet history books, the Civil War was presented in a very specific way. It was a glorious struggle of the working class against reactionary forces, foreign imperialists, and class enemies. The Red Terror was downplayed or justified as necessary revolutionary justice. The famine was blamed entirely on the whites and foreign intervention, not on Bolshevik policies. And all the messy details, all the atrocities committed by the Red Army, all the complexity and chaos, that was all cleaned up and simplified into a heroic story of revolutionary triumph. For 70 years, the Soviet government controlled all information about this period. Archives were sealed, witnesses were silenced, alternative narratives were suppressed. If you tried to tell a different version of events, you could end up in a prison camp, or worse. So multiple generations of Soviet citizens grew up learning a sanitized, propagandized version of this history. And because the Soviet Union was a closed society, Western historians had limited access to sources and documents that would tell the full story, but that's not the only reason. The Western countries that intervened in Russia had their own reasons for wanting to forget about this war. Think about it from their perspective. The intervention was a disaster. American, British, Canadian, and other troops were sent to Russia without a clear mission, without adequate support, and without any real understanding of what they were getting into. They suffered casualties, they achieved nothing, and when they came home, their governments didn't want to talk about it. It was embarrassing. In the United States, the American Expeditionary Force Siberia and the American Expeditionary Force North Russia were involved in combat operations against the Bolsheviks. American soldiers fought and died in places most Americans couldn't find on a map, and for what? The intervention failed. The Bolsheviks won anyway. And when the troops came home, the whole thing was quietly swept under the rug. There were no parades, no memorials, no Hollywood movies. It was just an uncomfortable footnote that most people wanted to forget. The same thing happened in Britain and other countries. The intervention was unpopular at home. Soldiers didn't want to be there. The public didn't understand why their boys were fighting in Russia when the Great War had just ended, and so when it was over, there was a collective agreement to just move on and pretend it hadn't happened. Plus, as the Cold War developed, bringing up the Western intervention in Russia would have been awkward. The Soviet Union used the intervention as propaganda, pointing to it as evidence of Western imperialism and hostility. Western governments didn't want to remind people about it because it complicated the Cold War narrative. There's also the simple fact that history is written by the winners and by those who tell compelling stories. World War I has a clear narrative. It has famous battles, iconic images, poetry, literature, and a definitive ending with the Treaty of Versailles. World War II has an even clearer narrative, with obvious villains and a satisfying conclusion. The Russian Civil War doesn't fit neatly into our historical narrative. It's messy, complex, morally ambiguous, and it doesn't have a satisfying ending for anyone except the Bolsheviks. It's harder to teach, harder to understand, and frankly, harder to care about if you're not Russian. But here's why we should care. The Russian Civil War set the stage for everything that followed. The brutality of the Civil War shaped the Soviet Union in fundamental ways. Stalin, who would go on to become one of the worst dictators in history, learned his methods during the Civil War. The use of terror as a political tool, the willingness to sacrifice millions of lives for ideological goals, the paranoia about enemies both foreign and domestic, all of this was forged in the crucible of the Civil War. The war also had enormous geopolitical consequences. The collapse of the Russian Empire led to the independence of Finland, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, and attempts at independence by Ukraine, Belarus, Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan. Some of these countries managed to maintain their independence until World War II. Others were forcibly reincorporated into the Soviet Union. The borders drawn during and after the Civil War, often arbitrarily and without regard for ethnic or cultural realities, created tensions that still exist today. The conflict between Russia and Ukraine that we see right now has roots that go back to the Civil War period. The intervention by Western powers created a deep sense of resentment and paranoia in the Soviet Union that persisted for decades. Soviet leaders genuinely believed that the capitalist West was out to destroy them, and they pointed to the intervention as proof. This paranoia influenced Soviet foreign policy throughout the Cold War and contributed to numerous international crises. When you understand the history of the Civil War and the intervention, you understand Soviet behavior during the Cold War much better. The Civil War also had a profound impact on political movements around the world. Communists in other countries saw the Bolshevik victory as proof that revolution was possible, that the working class could seize power and hold it against all odds. This inspired communist movements in China, Vietnam, Cuba, and dozens of other countries. At the same time, anti-communists pointed to the violence and chaos of the Russian Civil War as evidence of why communism must be opposed at all costs. The Civil War became a symbol and a warning that shaped political debates for generations. And let's not forget the human cost. 7 to 15 million people died. That's not just a statistic. That's millions of individual stories, millions of families destroyed, millions of lives cut short. There were children who starved to death during the famine. There were soldiers who froze to death in Siberia. There were civilians who were executed for being in the wrong place at the wrong time. There were entire villages that were wiped off the map. And all of these people, all of these stories have been largely forgotten by history. There's also something deeply troubling about the fact that we've allowed this history to be erased. It sets a dangerous precedent. If a conflict this large, this deadly, this consequential can be forgotten, what else have we forgotten? What other wars, what other atrocities, what other human catastrophes have slipped through the cracks of our collective memory? And perhaps more importantly, if we don't learn about these events, how can we prevent them from happening again? One of the things that strikes me most about the Russian Civil War is how modern it feels in many ways. This wasn't a traditional war with clear front lines and uniformed armies facing each other. This was a war where civilians were targets, where propaganda was a weapon, where foreign powers intervened in complex ways, where multiple factions fought for control, and where the lines between combatants and non-combatants were blurred. Sound familiar? It should, because this describes most of the conflicts we see in the world today. Syria, Yemen, Libya. These modern civil wars have echoes of what happened in Russia a century ago. The Russian Civil War also saw the use of some horrifying tactics that would unfortunately become common in later conflicts. Mass executions of civilians, hostage-taking, deliberate starvation as a weapon, concentration camps, ethnic cleansing. All of these were employed during the Civil War. The Bolsheviks established what they called labor camps, which were the predecessors of the Gulag system that would later imprison and kill millions. The whites carried out pogroms that killed tens of thousands of Jews, foreshadowing the even greater horrors of the Holocaust. And then there's the ideological dimension. The Russian Civil War was, at its core, a war about ideas. What kind of society should we have? Who should have power? How should resources be distributed? These aren't just Russian questions. These are universal questions that every society has to grapple with. The Civil War was fought between people who had radically different visions of what Russia should be, and they were willing to kill and die for those visions. That kind of ideological conflict didn't end with the Civil War. We're still having these debates today, and while we're fortunate that in most places they don't lead to such violence, the potential is always there. Let me tell you about some of the specific events from the Civil War that are just mind-blowing, and yet almost nobody knows about them. There was the execution of the Romanov family, Tsar Nicholas II and his wife and children, who were murdered by the Bolsheviks in Yekaterinburg in July 1918. This event is relatively well known, but what's less known is the confusion and mystery that surrounded it for years. The Bolsheviks initially denied it happened, then claimed only the Tsar had been killed, and the full truth didn't emerge until much later. There were numerous impostors who claimed to be surviving Romanovs, most famously Anna Anderson, who claimed to be Grand Duchess Anastasia. The remains of the family weren't definitively identified until DNA testing in the 1990s. There was the siege of Kazan in August 1918, where the Red Army, personally commanded by Leon Trotsky, recaptured the city from the Czechoslovak Legion and White forces. Trotsky arrived at the front in his armored train, which was essentially a mobile command center and propaganda machine. He rallied the demoralized Red Army troops, introduced harsh discipline, including summary executions of deserters, and led them to victory. This battle was a turning point in the war. If the Reds had lost Kazan, the whole course of the Civil War might have been different. There was the Kronstadt Rebellion in March 1921, where the sailors of the Kronstadt naval base, who had been among the most ardent supporters of the Bolshevik Revolution, rose up against the Bolshevik government. They were protesting the authoritarianism of the Bolshevik regime, the suppression of other socialist parties, and the economic policies that were causing hardship. The Bolsheviks crushed the rebellion with extreme violence, killing or imprisoning thousands of sailors. This event was particularly significant because it showed that the Bolsheviks were willing to turn on their own supporters if they dissented. It was a harbinger of the purges that would come later under Stalin. There were the campaigns in Central Asia, where the civil war merged with local conflicts and created unbelievable chaos. In some areas, the fighting continued well into the 1920s as the Red Army fought against the Basmachi movement, which was a broad coalition of Central Asian Muslims resisting Soviet rule. These campaigns involved brutal counterinsurgency tactics, mass deportations, and the suppression of Islamic culture and institutions. The echoes of this violence can still be felt in Central Asia today, and we can't forget about the famine refugees and orphans. The Civil War and the famine created millions of homeless children, known as bezprizorniki. These kids roamed the streets and countryside in gangs, stealing and begging to survive. It's estimated that there were between 4 and 7 million of these orphans by the early 1920s. The Soviet government eventually set up programs to deal with them, but the scale of the problem was overwhelming. Many of these children never recovered from the trauma of what they experienced. Now, I want to talk about how this history has been slowly rediscovered and re-examined, especially after the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991. When the Soviet archives were opened up, historians finally got access to documents and information that had been sealed for decades. What they found confirmed some things, contradicted others, and revealed details that nobody had known before. The death toll estimates were revised upward. The scale of the atrocities became clearer, and the complexity of the conflict, with all its various factions and motivations, came into sharper focus. Russian historians in particular have been grappling with this history in new ways. During the Soviet period, the Civil War was presented as a heroic struggle. After the fall of the Soviet Union, there was a tendency in some quarters to swing to the opposite extreme and portray the whites as the good guys and the reds as pure evil. But gradually, a more nuanced understanding has emerged. Most serious historians now recognize that both sides committed terrible atrocities, that the conflict was more complex than a simple good versus evil narrative, and that the suffering of ordinary people was the real tragedy of the Civil War. There have been some efforts to memorialize the victims of the Civil War. In Russia, there are monuments to various figures from that period, both red and white. There are museums dedicated to the Civil War, though they often reflect contemporary political biases. And there are historians and writers who are working to document the stories of individuals who lived through those years. But there's still a lot of work to be done. Many mass graves from the Civil War have never been properly investigated. Many victims have never been identified. And in some ways, the Civil War remains a contested and controversial period in Russian history. In the West, there's been a slow but growing interest in the Russian Civil War. More books are being published on the topic, documentaries are being made, and some educators are starting to include it in their curriculum, but it's still very much a niche topic, so Meaning that only history buffs and specialists really know much about. For the average person, it remains a blank spot in their historical knowledge. So what can we learn from the Russian Civil War? What lessons does it have for us today? I think there are several. First, it shows us the danger of political polarization and ideological extremism. When people become so committed to their vision of how society should be that they're willing to kill anyone who disagrees, you get catastrophic results. The inability of different groups to find common ground, to compromise, to see each other as fellow human beings rather than enemies to be destroyed, this led directly to the nightmare of the Civil War. Second, it shows us the danger of foreign intervention in civil conflicts. The intervention by Western powers in Russia was a disaster that achieved nothing except to prolong the suffering and to create lasting resentment. It's a lesson that we apparently haven't learned very well, given the numerous examples of failed interventions in the decades since. When outside powers try to influence the outcome of a civil war, they almost always make things worse. Third, it shows us the importance of remembering history, even when it's uncomfortable or complicated. The erasure of the Russian Civil War from popular memory has meant that we've lost important lessons and insights. We've forgotten the human cost of ideological conflict. We've forgotten the ways in which violence can spiral out of control. We've forgotten the suffering of millions of people. And in forgetting, we've made it easier for similar things to happen again. Fourth, it reminds us that history is not inevitable. At multiple points during the Civil War, things could have gone differently. If the whites had been more unified, if the intervention had been more effective, if the famine had not occurred, the Bolsheviks might have lost. And if that had happened, the entire course of 20th century history would have been different. No Soviet Union, no Cold War, no Stalin, no gulags. Of course, something else might have arisen that was equally bad or worse, but the point is that outcomes are not predetermined. History is made by human choices and actions, and those choices matter. The Russian Civil War also teaches us about resilience and survival. Despite everything they went through, despite the unimaginable horrors and suffering, most Russians survived and rebuilt their lives. The country eventually recovered, industrialized, defeated Nazi Germany in World War II, and became a superpower. The human capacity to endure and overcome even the worst circumstances is remarkable. But at the same time, trauma has long-lasting effects. The violence and suffering of the Civil War shaped Soviet culture and politics for generations. It created a climate of fear, suspicion, and acceptance of state violence that persisted for decades. I also think it's important to recognize the personal stories within this vast historical event. Every one of those millions of deaths was a person with hopes, dreams, fears, and loved ones. There was the soldier who froze to death in Siberia, far from home, fighting in a war he probably didn't understand. There was the mother who watched her children starve during the famine and had to make impossible choices about who would get the little food she had. There was the intellectual who was executed for having the wrong political views. There was the peasant whose village was burned by one army or another. These individual tragedies, multiplied millions of times over, are the real story of the Russian Civil War. And here's something else to think about. The erasure of this history hasn't been complete. In Russia, people know about the Civil War, even if their understanding of it is often shaped by propaganda and myth. There are family stories passed down through generations. There are local memories of events that happened in specific places. There are monuments and memorials, even if they're not widely known outside of Russia. The history is there, just beneath the surface, waiting to be fully acknowledged and understood. In recent years, with the rise of the internet and social media, information about the Russian Civil War has become more accessible. You can find documents, photographs, and personal accounts online. You can read academic papers and books that weren't available before. You can watch documentaries and lectures. The tools for learning about this history are available if you're willing to seek them out. But there's still a gap between the availability of information and public knowledge. Just because something is available doesn't mean people will engage with it. So why have I spent so much time talking about this? Because I think it matters. I think understanding the Russian Civil War is crucial for understanding the 20th century and even the world we live in today. It's a missing piece of the puzzle, and without it, our picture of history is incomplete. When we learn about World War I and then jump straight to World War II, we're missing the context for so much of what happened in between. We're missing the origins of the Soviet Union's behavior, the roots of the Cold War, the precedents for later atrocities, and the human cost of ideological conflict. And on a more fundamental level, I think we owe it to the millions of people who suffered and died in this conflict to remember them. They're not just statistics. They were human beings who deserved better than to be forgotten by history. By learning about what happened, by refusing to let this history be erased, we honor their memory and hopefully make it a little less likely that such things will happen again. The Russian Civil War was erased from textbooks for a combination of reasons, some deliberate and some accidental. The Soviet government wanted to control the narrative and hide their own crimes. Western governments wanted to forget an embarrassing intervention. Educators found it too complex to teach, and the public was more interested in other, more straightforward historical events. But the result is that one of the most important conflicts of the 20th century has been largely forgotten, and that's a tragedy. As we wrap up, I want to leave you with this thought. History is not just about the past, it's about understanding how we got to where we are today, and hopefully learning lessons that can guide us in the future. The Russian Civil War teaches us about the dangers of extremism, the costs of foreign intervention, the importance of political compromise, and the resilience of the human spirit. These are lessons that remain relevant today. In a world that still sees civil wars, ideological conflicts, and humanitarian disasters, we need to remember what happened in Russia between 1918 and 1922. We need to remember the millions who died, the suffering they endured, and the ways in which that conflict shaped the world we live in. So the next time you think about the gap between World War I and World War II, remember that there wasn't really a gap at all. There was a war, a massive, devastating war that killed millions and changed the world. It wasn't erased because it didn't matter. It was erased because it mattered too much, because the truth was too uncomfortable, too complicated, too challenging to fit into the narratives that various parties wanted to tell. But the truth has a way of surviving, even when it's suppressed. And now you know the truth. Now you know about the secret war that was erased from the textbooks, and hopefully you'll share this knowledge with others, because these stories deserve to be told, and these victims deserve to be remembered. Thanks so much for watching. If this video opened your eyes to a part of history you didn't know about, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Drop a comment below and let me know what you think. Were you aware of the Russian Civil War before watching this? What other forgotten conflicts do you think deserve more attention? I read all your comments and I love hearing from you. And if you want to support the channel and help me make more videos like this, check out the links in the description. Until next time, keep questioning, keep learning, and remember that history is never as simple as it seems. Peace.